I've always loved animals. Growing up, my house was never without a dog or two. Maybe a cat. And even the occasional rabbit. So, when I moved out and got my own place, it didn't take long before I adopted a dog of my own. A scruffy black mutt. I named it Shadow. He was a stray, found wandering near the edge of the woods behind my house. And something about his sad, golden eyes made it impossible for me to leave him there. He had a collar when I found him. It was old, leather, and worn, with small metallic studs around it. I figured it must have been from his previous owner, though it didn't have a tag. The first night I brought him home, I noticed the collar jingled softly when he moved. It wasn't like a normal jingle, though. It was faint, almost melodic, and it seemed louder at night. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination. Shadow was a sweet dog, obedient, affectionate, and surprisingly calm. But within a week, I started to notice strange things. My cat, Daisy, who had never been scared of anything, refused to come into the same room as Shadow. She'd hiss and arch her back, her eyes darting between him and the corners of the room, like she could see something I couldn't. And then there were the whispers. It started faintly, like a soft breeze brushing past my ears. At first, I thought it was just the sound of Shadow's collar jingling. But one night, while I was lying in bed, I heard it clearly. A soft voice, almost too faint to make out, coming from somewhere in the room. "Let me in." I sat up so fast I scared myself. Shadow was lying on the floor at the foot of my bed, his eyes wide open and fixed on me. The collar jingled softly as he tilted his head, and I swear to God, I heard it again. "Let me in." I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided the collar had to go. I tried to take it off, but no matter how hard I pulled, the buckle wouldn't budge. Shadow whimpered and squirmed, his calm demeanor gone. I left it alone for the time being, figuring I'd take him to a vet or a groomer to have it removed. That evening, things got worse. Daisy was nowhere to be found. I called for her all over the house, but she didn't come. Shadow, on the other hand, was pacing back and forth near the basement door, his nails clicking against the floor. And then I heard it. Scratching. It was faint, like claws dragging across wood, coming from the basement. My heart dropped. I knew Daisy must have gotten down there somehow, even though I hadn't opened the door in weeks. I grabbed a flashlight and went down to find her. But the moment I stepped onto the basement floor, the air turned ice cold. The scratching stopped. I scanned the room with my flashlight, calling Daisy's name. That's when I saw the shadows. They were moving along the walls, twisting and writhing like smoke. And in the center of the room stood Shadow, his collar jingling softly. His eyes weren't golden anymore. They were black. Deep, empty black, like staring into a void. And then I heard the voice again, louder this time, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You let me in." I ran. I didn't even think. I just bolted up the stairs, slammed the door behind me, and locked it. Shadow didn't follow, but I could hear him down there, pacing, his collar jingling with every step. I never saw Daisy again. The next morning, I called animal control, but when they arrived, there was no sign of Shadow. The basement was empty. The collar, however, was lying in the middle of the floor, perfectly intact. I moved out a week later. But sometimes, late at night, I think I can still hear it. The faint jingling of a collar, somewhere in the dark. I thought it was over, until a week later, I found Daisy, or what I thought was Daisy, in the woods behind my house. She looked unharmed, This strange encounter never stops whispering in my brain till now. I had just sold my old house and moved to a new one. The change was necessary. I needed a fresh start. The new house was perfect, spacious, peaceful, and tucked away on the edge of town. But once I settled in, something felt off. The silence of the house was overwhelming, and I found myself missing the company of someone or something. I couldn't shake the feeling of loneliness, so I decided to adopt a cat. Oscar, a small, quiet black cat, was the perfect companion. He was calm and gentle, and when I brought him home, he seemed to settle in right away. For the first few days, everything was fine. He would curl up on the couch next to me, and we'd enjoy the quiet of the house together. But as the nights passed, I started to notice odd things. It began with small changes. Oscar would stare at the same corner of the living room for hours. His gaze was fixed, unwavering, as though something invisible was there. I tried to shrug it off as just a quirk, but it was impossible to ignore. Then, the shadows started. One night, I woke up to hear soft scratching noises coming from the living room. I got out of bed to investigate, but when I reached the room, I found Oscar sitting still, staring at the same corner again. I turned on the lights, thinking maybe he was just startled by a mouse or some small creature, but the house was still. Over the next few nights, the odd behavior continued. I noticed shadows flickering in the corners of my vision, moving across the walls even though there was no one there. At times, I could hear faint footsteps in the hallway, but when I checked, there was no one around. I started to wonder if the house was haunted. The thought seemed crazy at first, but I couldn't ignore the strange occurrences anymore. Oscar seemed unaffected by it all, just calmly sitting in the shadows, staring as if he knew something I didn't. I did some digging into the history of the house, and that's when I found out there had been previous owners, but none of them had stayed for long. They had all moved out abruptly, and the house had been empty for years before I bought it. No one had ever spoken about why they left, but I felt certain now, something in the house wasn't right. Oscar had been with me through it all, never reacting to the eerie happenings. Perhaps he was just a cat, trying to make sense of the same things I was. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had chosen me, just as it had chosen the others before me.